Woo! That is such a great intro. I love it. I love it. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to your friendly neighborhood atheist. We are here today with another episode of Ask an Atheist, and I am your host, Secular Rarity. I have questions, and the good news is that I have an awesome guest to get some answers from. We've got Micheal Granado. What's up, man?
Ooh,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you. I'm really I've been looking forward to this conversation. It was my spring break last week. I was like doing some reading just to like refresh myself.
Yeah.
I've been really looking forward to it. So
Yeah, awesome, man. Well, good, because we've got some fun stuff to talk about. I think you had sent hey, this is the kind of stuff that I'm really interested in, and this is the stuff that my your PhD thesis is in and stuff. So this is awesome. Like this is actually somebody, folks, that has degrees, that has the ability to back up what they're saying, unlike me, which is just spouting random BS and just hoping it sticks. But before we go like too far off the rails and Ethan just face palms and sighs profusely, Micheal, tell everybody just a little bit about your background and kind of what you do with your channel and stuff.
absolutely, yeah. So I'll talk about my educational background because I do have degrees, yes, but it doesn't necessarily. I should specify it doesn't necessarily pertain to this exactly. My background is in history and philosophy, BA in philosophy, MA in history, MTS in theological studies. I was
Awesome.
in theology school for a bit. I'm currently working on my PhD, loosely in the humanities. My area of focus is broadly in the history and philosophy of science. The further up the educational ladder you go, the narrower and
Mm-hmm.
narrower your topic gets. So I tend to frame it broadly as history and philosophy of science because the actual specialties in a French philosopher named Gaston Bachelard and a debate that happened between another French philosopher, Henry Bergson, and Albert Einstein in the 1920s in France. So my thesis is on kind of the reception of relativity in French
Mm,
philosophy and how that
pretty cool.
overlaps with the philosophy of time. But if I say that, then people start tuning out. So
It's it
history and
it
philosophy of science. Yeah.
It is definitely, that is very much a niche and nuanced topic, but one that I don't know if you can tell my giddiness already by it. It just sounds so freaking cool. It sounds so interesting. And because yeah, I mean, and look, I'm just going to say this. There are implications for like religion. What exactly is going on with time? How is that working, right? A
Yeah.
theory, B theory.
Mhm.
If it's one or the other, that could really change some stuff for God and his knowledge and all of this.
Mhm.
So it does have some application, man. I would say that is a pretty cool topic. And you
Yeah.
you also do videos. You do some kind of pushing
Yes.
back on like counter apologetic stuff. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, yeah. So I've been on YouTube. My YouTube channel is actually pretty old. So I'm also an educator by trade. I've been teaching. This is my 11th year of teaching. So
Wow.
it's what I've dedicated my life to. Plan on dedicating the rest of my life to it. Teaching's my passion, my
Awesome.
calling. Right,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
what
that's
I
right.
want to do. But I started my YouTube channel because to store lecture videos for my classes. I was teaching an
Mm.
online class, and the more I moving away from the lecture videos, I've also, as an educator, I started having a lot of conversations with my students about kind of it started off with like conspiracy theories, kind of like
Mm.
general like anti-intellectualism. Like they would come to me and be like, I heard aliens built the pyramids. You're a
Right.
history teacher, what do you think about that?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
So
yeah.
from there I kind of started branching out, and I also kind of caught wind of popular level, I would say like popular level apologetic arguments concerning, for example, the history of science and Christianity, which immediately
Mhm.
caught my attention to, kind of listen to what they were saying. And then also, you know, conversations about the relationship between Christianity and slavery. And,
Mm.
you know, I've been teaching American history for about 6-7 years now. So American slavery is an integral part of that. And kind of responding to some of those videos and calling out what I see as intentional or not. I think it just depends on the person, but misrepresentations, misreadings, not only of history, but also of like academic consensus. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's, man, I'm telling you, that is right up my alley, man. I was such a history nerd, always have been. One of my favorite early American history stories is about the Newburgh conspiracy and Washington coming in and, you know, having to read this letter from Congress. It's such a cool story. And I'm sure I'll tell it one of these days to people, but yeah, let's go into that a little bit. This is something I definitely come across, and you know, I think a lot of our viewers here will as well. This conversation about how the introduction of like a formalized scientific method and like all of the really cool nuancy things we've got today, that only comes about because of a Christian world, right? That is the argument that is being presented to me fairly regularly. And I guess, help me out, man. Like, is this just complete and utter BS? Is there like a nugget of truth there? I mean, what is this?
Yeah, it's hard to unpack. And the reason why it's hard to unpack is there are a lot of moving parts here. And so I think how I approach it is to start with more so philosophy than history. And to sound like a stereotypic pedantic philosopher, we need to start off with definitions. The most important definition. And this is really, and you know, maybe it's frustrating for people, maybe it's not fun to listen to sit here and have people talk about the definitions of words, but the entire apologetic argument, or most apologetic arguments that I hear, that Christianity is somehow solely responsible for the rise of science, hinges almost entirely on their definition of science.
Okay.
To start off with.
All right. Well, so that's important. And I think, you know, I'm with you. I get it. I know that there are some people that they say, man, look, why do we got to go through 20 minutes of arguing about the definition of a word? But if we're both using two completely different definitions of the word, we could actually both be correct in what we're saying, right? And so to actually make progress, we do need to hash that out. So, okay, I'm glad you started with that, man. What is that definition that they're using?
Yes. So the problem is they almost always don't define what they mean by science.
Oh,
which allows them to get away with it.
Right.
And, you know, I'm speaking very broadly, like the view from a mile up here, but, you know, this is a popular argument. I have several videos on my channel reviewing, for example, David Wood makes this argument. Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy makes this argument. I've actually spoke with Michael Jones before on my channel. Was a really awesome conversation. And on the off chance, not that I think that David Wood would see this and like actually want to talk to me, but David Wood, if you ever do want to talk, I've made like 5 videos about you. So putting that out there in the ether.
That's right. Pray on it.
Yeah, I'll pray on it. David Wood, Michael Jones. I've even heard William Lane Craig, John Lennox makes this argument a lot. And then most recently, I was watching a video by Gavin Ortlund, who I've also spoken with before, who just came out with a video about Galileo. But almost always the definition of science is assumed. And I think one of the reasons, I'm going to complicate this a bit more before I talk about the definition. One of the reasons why they're able to get away with it, to go back to dig deeper into philosophy, and this is going to sound a little strange, but
Mm-hmm.
you know, I do teach philosophy, so I am a little strange, I suppose. But you know, what is science? Science is really weird,
Mm.
and it's really hard to define.
Yeah.
In fact, it's so hard to define that most of the 20th century philosophy of science dealt with this problem, and it's called the problem of demarcation,
Mm-hmm.
which is how do we distinguish between science and pseudoscience?
Mm-hmm.
And all of the big names of 20th century philosophy, Bertrand Russell, Karl Popper, Thomas Kuhn, Amir
Yeah.
Lakatos, all dedicated significant portions of their career to answering this question. So the
Mm-hmm.
reason why apologists are able to get away with it is because we don't actually have a great definition of science.
Right. And this is where what I was thinking once you were saying that, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this makes sense. That's where like the criteria of like falsifiability and stuff starts coming in and being an important thing for you know, philosophical thought. And yeah, okay. So
Mhm.
it's the fact that by its very nature, science is this kind of amorphous, changing kind of thing. Like we know some things are definitely not science.
Right.
But then there are other things where it's just kind of like, does this exactly fall in the realm? It feels it's science-y, but is it science? Okay. That's
Yeah.
important.
Yes. And, you know, 20th century philosophers, as you can imagine, didn't really come to an agreement on this
Mm,
problem. And demarcation, by the way, is how do we distinguish between science and pseudoscience? And answering that question allows us to draw theoretically hard lines about, okay, this is science, this is not science.
mhm.
Physics is science, astrology is not science.
Right.
Chemistry is science, alchemy is not. It allows us to draw those lines. And basically what towards the end of the 20th century, what the agreement was is it's we can look at some things and say, yes, obviously physics is a science.
Mm-hmm.
If
Mm-hmm.
anything's a science,
Right.
physics has got to be a science. Right. And then maybe we can throw in like chemistry, biology, and then where you really start to maybe ruffle some feathers, we can put in, psychology is definitely a science.
Yeah.
The medical sciences are
Yeah.
definitely a science. Where it starts to get a little shaky, maybe like economics. Where do we,
Economics. Yeah, yeah. People don't like to talk about the fact
sociology?
that economics is a soft science, but it is, you guys. So
Yeah.
think about that.
Yeah. So, but that's where the debate and the discussion. And then there are some things we can look at and say, most probably, definitely not.
Mm,
If we could think of it as a spectrum with
mhm.
definitely a science on one end and probably not a science, then there's
Right.
other stuff like homeopathy or I don't know, bleach to cure cancer,
Mm,
whatever,
mhm, mhm.
insert whatever medical remedy
Right.
you heard on TikTok here, right? Um, and so the reason why that's important is because there's this historical question. And on a surface level, it seems like a legitimate historical question,
Mm.
which is okay, when did science start?
Yeah.
When did science begin? And where did science begin? It seems like we ought to be able to give a historical explanation for that.
Mhm.
But again, the problem is, and if you ever encounter an apologist or if you have a conversation with somebody who wants to make the argument that science directly stems from Christianity, or let's see, I have a quote here by Rodney Stark, who's a sociologist, but also a Christian apologist, who said that this is from his book, For the Glory of God. Theological assumptions unique to Christianity explain why science was born only in Christian Europe.
Right.
So,
Right.
and this is and then you also hear like similar sentiments. And I've been trying to think about where this comes from, but I'm going to blame a obscure philosopher named Albert Whitehead, who wrote a book. who said that science derived from Christian ideas, but it's repeated by people like Tom Holland is an author that Inspiring Philosophy likes to cite. For example, David Wood also likes to cite Tom Holland. And so for the start of science, they like to point to, it depends on the person, but 15th century Europe.
Sure.
Scientific revolution.
Right.
Right. So people, Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, all those big people. And they like to make the claim that science started in Europe and that subsequently the reason for that, the historical explanation for that, is that Christianity somehow played a unique, a special, or a epistemologically prior or basic role in the formation of science as we know it today.
Right. That it could not, like, inherently have happened anywhere else in the world because it was the Christendom of Western Europe at the time. Okay. Yeah. I think that's good question real quick. Is homeopathy junk science, Micheal? Stake your claim.
I think you would need to get, I'm all about expert opinion. I'm not a medical expert. Speak with a medical expert. My inclination is that they would tell you that yes, it is. But again, not my area of expertise. But
don't be doing homeopathy, people. Tell your homies no if they want to opathy. But okay. So we have the claim. I think it's one that, again, a lot of us have heard. It is something very, very specific and unique to Christianity that gives us the foundation for science as we know it. So how do we know that that's not true? How do we know that is just not the case? You know, I don't feel like it's the case, but you know, we don't go on feelings here. We go on that evidence. So yeah, what do you say to push back against that claim?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I had a conversation with David Hutchins and James Uriangu, and I'm sorry, James, I always mispronounce your name. But this is another book that's cited a lot by apologists of popes and unicorns. So I was having a conversation with them, and they knew ahead of time what my position was. I knew ahead of time what their position was. And so I asked them, well, okay, define science for me. And I think James made the claim, and I'd have to go back and watch to what he exactly said, but he laid out his criteria, which he lays out in the book, which was, science is a fact-finding discipline about the natural world, that science utilizes, for example, mathematical reasoning in its explanations of the natural world, that it's institutionalized in the sense that it's not just a single person sitting in their backyard with a telescope, that there's bodies of knowledge built around it in the forms of schools, institutions, governments. So my response to that is, okay, well, by that definition, science has appeared, and this is, in history, it's all about sources and documentation.
Right.
So historically speaking, by that definition, I could point to, for example, the Gupta Empire in India, which I think dates to like the 4th century BCE, lasted for like 400 years. I could
definitely before Christ.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
Definitely not Christian.
Yeah.
I can point to any of the Mesoamerican civilizations, the Olmec, the Mayans, the Aztecs. Also before Christ, also had no contact with the West at all. And this is one thing I definitely want to come back to. Most importantly, I can also point to, for example, the Ottoman Empire, which lasted for roughly 800 years, which was predominantly Muslim, and which had a system of science which was almost unraveled. unrivaled up until the modern period. But in all of these places, there were systematic studies of the natural world, was institutionalized. There were schools, there were bodies of knowledge that were passed down from one generation to the next. There were techniques of observations. There was use of instruments. They didn't have things like telescopes, but like the Mayans, for example, built observatories that wouldn't be rivaled until the invention of the telescope. Extraordinarily accurate, detailed star charts measuring the movements of the planets. They had the Mesoamericans developed their own mathematical system. You know, if you want to move away from the example of physics and you want to include things like medicine, which is certainly a science, the ancient Egyptians were doing like freaking brain surgeries like 2000 BCE. Like,
that is really wild to see.
And they weren't doing it in a vacuum. It's not like they're like, okay, I'm going to cut open somebody's head. No, they were doing it to relieve. I think it was like the person was having like repeated headaches. They were doing it for medical reasons, and there were medical bodies of knowledge built around it. So my first and I think most important pushback is to say, if you're unable to give a definition of science that rules out all of these other examples, then you're not able to say that science only appeared in Europe in the 15th century. And if science appeared in other places and in other cultures that were not Christian, some of which existed before Christianity even started, then it would seem that there are other historical influences at play other than Christianity.
Right. And I think that is, again, it's very important. We have to say, look, what is it that you mean by science? And I think, with the definition that you just gave right there, I mean, two aspects to it. One, I don't think that's a bad definition. I think that's a pretty decent definition, but it encompasses a lot. It encompasses quite a lot of things. And ultimately what that means is that, you have to look to various ancient Chinese empires, various, Middle Eastern, ancient Near Eastern cultures, and just completely and utterly close your eyes to what they're doing, because otherwise they hit that definition spot on. So let me play a little bit of the devil's advocate. That's what we're here to do, right? So I've seen this happen a bit where it's kind of like a Mott and Bailey. So they throw out the real strong, claim, and they say, science only came about because of Christendom. And then you kind of push back a little bit, and then they retreat real hard to a much more easier claim to defend. I want to know if this is a claim that can be defended. So we say, hey, science started because of Christianity. It couldn't have happened anywhere else. We push back a little. We bring some evidence. They go, okay. Well, actually, science couldn't have perpetuated in the way that it did without Christianity. Maybe it started somewhere else, but it was only because of Christian Europe at the time that it became such an important thing. What do you say against that? Is there a pushback?
So with most of history, this is where history as a discipline differs from philosophy, for example, or differs from like mathematics that has very like strict and defined forms of reasoning, because history is, and this is usually what I start off these conversations by saying, like, history is extraordinarily complicated, like beyond imagination.
Yeah.
And it's also very messy, and human beings are not, this might come as a shock or a surprise, but human beings aren't always rational, and human beings aren't always consistent. And for any one historical event, there are thousands of causes.
Sure. Sure.
Right. So my first sort of pushback is to say, to reduce anything, no matter if we're talking about the origins of science, if we're talking about, why did World War I start? Or what
Right.
were the causes of the American Civil War? Or take your pick. The explanation, and the reason for this, we've been trained ever since elementary school to treat history like a multiple choice test. That if
Yeah.
somebody asks you what caused World War I, you're going to say the assassination of the Archduke
Ferdinand, right?
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
of course you are. Of course.
Circle, check.
That's
you're
it.
done,
That's
right?
it. Though.
You move
Yeah.
along.
Yeah.
So my first pushback is to say, well, let's get away from elementary school history, right? Let's realize that historical causes are deep, extraordinarily complicated, and oftentimes are contradictory and just a jumbled mess. So to go back to to the softer claim that repeat that for me so I can respond to it.
Yeah, no problem. The softer claim of just being like, okay, maybe science didn't start from Christendom, but because of the Christian nature of Western Europe at the time, science was able to perpetuate and become, this dominant force today. And that none of the other religions or anything could have done that. Again, back to that, there's still something unique, but instead of inventing science, we just made it all the more better.
Yeah. So yes and no. Yes, in the sense that European science in the 15th and 16th century grew out of the university system that was a direct result of the Catholic Church.
Sure.
The Catholic Church had a monopoly on education, especially what we would consider higher education in the medieval world, beginning in 9th, 10th century. I'm a little fuzzy about that. For people that needed advanced degrees in things like medicine, law, theology were the three most popular ones, right? And subsequently, the first major scientist of what we would call the early scientific revolution, Copernicus, for example, was employed by the Catholic Church. He was right about canon law. Galileo was a mathematics teacher at the University of Pisa, which was funded by the Catholic Church at the time. Kepler was receiving funding. So in a sense, yes. There were no other options unless you were privately funded by an extremely wealthy somebody that was just wanting to fund you just for the sake of funding you, which did happen, especially in this Italian city-states. There's a lot of extraordinarily wealthy traders that were doing that. But the pushback I would give is going back to history's oftentimes not that simple. And just go back to the stronger claim for a second, and then let me return to this.
Yeah, please.
So if we're saying that Christianity is solely responsible for the rise of modern science and that only Christianity, aside from pointing out the examples of science developing elsewhere, another question that I like to ask is, okay, when did Christianity become the dominant religion of the Western world?
Yeah, good question.
Right. So the answer to that is, let's say, around the 4th century.
Yeah,
CE.
way earlier than the scientific revolution, huh?
So you see where this is going, right?
Oh, that's a beautiful point.
So if Christianity is uniquely responsible for the rise of science, why didn't it develop earlier?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, that is. And that ties right into the softer claim as well. I mean, because again, okay, sure, fine, let's grant, let's move into that space and say, okay, you've conceded that it didn't create science, but it perpetuated at a much better pace. But then did it really? If 1100 years has to go by, that's a pretty slow pace, man.
Right. So I think the more level-headed response, if you get somebody to follow along with that, would be for them to recognize, well, okay, it seems like there's probably other historical causes at play here.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I want to be crystal clear here. Christianity did play a part in the development
Yes.
of modern science.
Yes.
That is a non-controversial claim.
Right. Right.
No historian worth their salt would disagree with that claim.
Right.
What apologists do is nudge it a step further, right? And then a step further. Let's see how far we could take this to the point where you get people like Rodney Stark that say it was the science only appeared in Europe because of Christianity.
Right. Again, it is not the case that we are saying, because, you know, as is the wonderful world of YouTube and the internet, right? People are going to say, "Oh, Micheal, SR, you guys are just biased atheists. You're looking for any reason to discount Christianity, you know, as doing something." No, we are totally 100% saying, yes, the information seems to tell us that it was through these Christian institutions that the beginnings of modern science were able to, you know, become much more fruitful and flourish a lot more than in other places. But again, to argue that that is specifically because of some unique aspect of Christianity really is missing the point. If the dominant culture at the time had been Islam, if the dominant culture at the time had been paganism, and they had created those institutions, it probably would have happened really similarly. Like,
yes.
Okay.
And
I love it.
I also want to point out, so yes, Christianity played a part, but like I was saying about history is oftentimes a both and rather than an either or. So there was a very popular narrative in the early 20th century, which was called the conflict thesis. And atheists also need to take responsibility for this, because it was perpetuated by people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris. But the conflict thesis is this idea that science and Christianity have been perpetually at war with each other. And that if you look at the history of science, what you will see is Christianity constantly trying to suppress the rise and the development of science.
Sure.
So I bring that up to say that the story of the relationship between science and Christianity is oftentimes a both and. And there are concrete examples of Christianity helping science flourish. The development of the university system is probably one of the biggest examples of that. But I also want to share, this is a quote from William Burns. It's a book called The Scientific Revolution and Global Perspective. Christianity actually also, at its infancy in the 4th, 5th century, also may have hindered scientific development by shifting the focus, the philosophical focus. And Burns says that ancient science declined significantly after the 2nd century and lost most of its intellectual drive after the era of Ptolemy and Galen, both of whom were Greek scientists, not Christian, before the rise of Christianity. So Greek science has a marked decline after the 2nd century. And one reason, not the sole reason, but a reason for this is a diminished interest in science after the Roman Empire had an increased focus on otherworldly concerns and the major Christological debates that were happening in the 2nd and 3rd, the major theological debates that were happening in the 2nd and 3rd century, which inadvertently shifted the focus of academics and scholars away from natural philosophy into theology.
Again, I really, really appreciate this, because I think it is so important, you know. Even as somebody that, yeah, man, I love to push back against the religion. I love to push back against the bad ideologies, but we shouldn't do so with poor argumentation. We shouldn't do so with incorrect, you know, historical analysis. We need to come at this and be clear-eyed about this and straightforward. And there are times, undeniably, where hand in hand, the Christian faith or various religious institutions are building scientific endeavors. They are strengthening this toolkit for us. But it's not whole cloth. It is not black or white. There are some times where, they fund the research, but then maybe they don't want to put out the paper. So like they help a little, but then they kind of pull us back a bit, or they agree with something and then shift the focus, somewhere else. So that is awesome. I think it is good that, again, we be as honest and as accurate as possible. So it's not that religion has constantly just been this, oh man, we hate science thing. There has been a lot of times where they've worked together.
100%. Absolutely.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah. And another historical point I like to bring up related to this question of the development of science, because there is something unique that starts to happen in the 15th and 16th century as a direct result of people like Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. What's sometimes referred to as the scientific revolution. And although I do have a video on my channel talking about the historical methodology about the scientific revolution, whether or not there was a scientific revolution.
Yeah.
But regardless of that, leaving that aside for a second, there is something unique that's happening there, and why it's happening is open to discussion. Again, there's a lot of influences and causes for this. One of the things that I have found particularly interested in, that I've focused on, specifically as a result of my focus on French philosophy in the early 20th century, there's a French historian and philosopher named Alexander Corre, who wrote a book, From a Closed World to an Infinite Universe, which talks about the development of science. And Corre's central thesis is that the reason why, a major reason why the scientific revolution happens when it does, hinges a lot on the Western acceptance of, and there's a lot of sources for this, a lot of places where this comes from, but hinges upon the rejection of Aristotelian physics and cosmology. Which is not as sexy as how the scientific revolutions traditionally
Sure. Yeah, that makes it less of a bang and an excitement, and people coming up with a bunch of really cool ideas, and a lot more of like people just waking up going like, yeah, I don't know if I believe that so much anymore. That does, it kind of puts a damper on it, man. I can see it.
But it's still interesting. It's still
of course it is, and it's true. Like, that's the point.
And what makes it more interesting related to this point is that Aristotle, and this is hard to overemphasize, but for people, but Aristotle, the Greek philosopher Aristotle, held such a iron grip on thought in the European Mediterranean world for over 1,000 years. This level of intellectual influence is something that we will never see again. Like, one person will not have that much of an influence on the world as Aristotle did. Thomas Aquinas, the major theologian from the medieval period, would just refer to Aristotle in his writing as the philosopher. Wow. As if no other philosophers existed. Because he was that influential.
Wow.
But historically, one of the interesting things that happened is that a lot of the works of Aristotle, especially his cosmology, as well as the works of Ptolemy, who was another ancient Greek astronomer, and the medical works of Galen, actually become lost in Europe, starting in like the 5th and 6th century.
Right.
What's typically referred to as the you've heard of the Dark Ages, which is a misrepresentation, but it gets the name because a lot of information was lost, specifically information of the Greek philosophers and scientists. that re-enters Europe around the start of the scientific revolution with the fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans, and it re-enters Europe through the Islamic world.
Right.
Not only does Aristotle come back into Europe, but Muslim commentaries on Aristotle come into Europe. And it was actually Muslim astronomers who were the first to mathematically and scientifically call into question a lot of Aristotle's cosmological claims. And people like Nicholas Copernicus in his on the revolution of heavenly spheres, Copernicus cites Islamic scholars, I think like 5 or 6 times.
Fascinating.
And he doesn't cite a lot of people. So the influence of the non-Christian world, the two big non-Christian influences on science are first and foremost the Greeks.
Right.
Euclidean geometry, Ptolemy with astronomy, Aristotle's cosmology, Galen's medical science. You don't get science without those people. Like, just full stop. Like, science isn't going to science as we know it isn't going to emerge without them. And they were not Christian.
Yeah.
On top of that, you don't really get the rejection of Aristotle really until Islamic scholars start to respond. People like Thomas Aquinas held Aristotle in such a high regard that Aquinas took one of the most basic Christian doctrines, the doctrine of creation, and the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, the creation from nothing. Because Aristotle posited that the universe was infinite, Aquinas had to rethink his theological position. That's how seriously he took Aristotle.
Right. Yeah, that is intense.
Yeah, Aristotle was a big deal. But it was the Muslim scholars that really start to say, like, oh, maybe there's some issues here. Specifically, they start to provide the sort of mathematics that was needed to develop, because we talk about heliocentrism, right, which is the sun-centered universe, versus geocentrism.
Right.
There was zero observation involved in this. If you read, I should have brought my copy of Copernicus's On the Revolution of Heavenly Spheres. It's just star charts and mathematical proofs. That's
really
most of what it is, right? And you don't get that level of mathematical development without the Islamic influence. But what's telling, if you listen to David Wood, you're going to hear none of that.
Yeah.
Because, well, with David Wood, we get we're getting into like Islamophobia territory. But even with people like I was listening to like a lecture by Stephen Meyer talking about the origins of the scientific revolution. Where it becomes problematic is not once did he mention Islamic scientist.
Right.
So the question at that point becomes, why aren't you talking about these people?
Right. And again, I think it's been very clear. You have not at any point in time dismissed the work that was done by various Christian scientists, or the ability to perpetuate these things through various Christian institutions. You are very much acknowledging and accepting and pinning that up on the board clear for everybody to see. It is just simply that, hey, if you're going to do that, you should just also be fair to all of these other, non-Christian Greek, Muslim scientists, the people that came thousands of years before were undeniably a major, major part in that. I think that is, honestly, that's cooler, in my opinion. That's a cooler story, because before, this story was just essentially, yeah, everybody else out there is just kind of a dumb idiot standing around in darkness until my belief system came along, and now everybody can see. It's like, no, actually what happened is it is the specific blending of various cultures and ideologies, and the ability to critique and comment on those older ideas, that is what gives us our modern science. That's really cool, man. That's a great story.
Yeah, and this has emerged really over the last 30 years, which is to put the development of the scientific revolution in global perspective. And this is important historically to get the story right, but it's also important because I don't think a lot of apologists realize this, but by making the argument that science only appeared in Europe, and it was only because of Christianity, you are also feeding into another reason why the scientific revolution happened the way it is. And this is the darker side to history as a fair warning, was because of the spread of European colonialism.
I'm glad. That's perfect, man, because this is a perfect segue into the next thing I want to talk about with you. Because I mean, I read what's his name? Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, many years ago. It's fascinating the way that he puts these different pieces together. And definitely one of the things that is undeniably important for Western Europe during that period of time is the fact that there was an immense amount of raw materials now being brought in at absurd quantities and bottom out prices, and we have to address it full on because it was the only reason they could do this, was the massive amounts of slaves that they owned.
Yes.
So this is the tie-in here.
Yeah.
Another argument that we hear a lot, another discussion point that comes up in this space regularly is about Christianity's relationship to slavery. Now we run the gauntlet on this here, as to what people will, try to defend. Let's start with the big one. Let's start with the strong one, man. Look, Michael, I've read the Bible a lot, and I'm just telling you, there is no slavery in there. Not a bit. There is nothing that you can point to that is slavery. I mean, prove me wrong, man. Change my mind.
Yes. I've heard that before. And let me immediately start off by saying, my knowledge of history is of modern history, right? I deal with early 20th century.
Right.
So take what I say here with a grain of salt. I'll point you to Digital Hammurabi. Dr. Josh has a lot of.
He wrote a book on it.
He wrote the book on it. Yes. And what is Dr. Josh's book titled? I can't remember.
Did the Old Testament endorse slavery? Just straight up and down. Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
And Dr. Josh's answers to that is yes, it did. So if you want to get mad at Dr. Josh, not at me.
Yeah.
But there are explicit references in the Hebrew Bible about the buying and selling of slaves, the owning of slaves, the treatment of slaves. Important for modern history is that Christians bought and sold slaves. Were there debates in the 15th, 16th century around the ethics of owning slaves within the church? Yes. And going back to what I said earlier about people, the same group of people holding contradictory opinions, Christians argued for both sides.
Yeah.
Right? That it was morally permissible for a Christian to own a slave, to buy and sell a slave.
Right.
And that it was morally impermissible for Christians to buy and sell slaves. And this argument takes a slight turn in the modern world because, and I've had people, push back a little bit against this, but there is a distinction between ancient forms of slavery and modern slavery.
Sure.
And by modern slavery, I mean the transatlantic slave trade and the system of slavery that began with European colonization.
Sure.
and there's distinctions to be made there. But I don't want to start dipping my toes, going down the rabbit hole of history before I address your question. There were slave owning peoples of the Jewish faith in the Hebrew Bible.
Mhm.
And at the time of the New Testament, we get to the time of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was a slave-based society.
Mhm. Mhm. And it's not until, I mean, what, the 1800s
Yes.
that the abolition of slavery becomes this. So again, back to the point that you brought up a minute ago, because I think this is, I really like this point. Like, when did Western Europe really change over to become dominantly Christian? Well, it was a good while ago. Why did it take another 1400 years
Yes.
before this came around?
Yes, absolutely. That's the big point here. So to unpack this, and I have and if it bothers me to read quotes, I don't, but
No, please.
there's a lot of good quotes.
Yeah.
One I want to share, because I'm not a historian of the ancient world. So I want to be clear about this. So yes, Roman civilization was a slave owning civilization. We don't get any form of abolitionist movement. And by abolitionism, I'm talking about the social movement to end the institution of slavery.
Right.
So there were people, and there were also non-Christians, who objected to the practice who objected to owning slaves.
Yeah.
Stoic philosophers, for example, who were not Christian, who were Greek, made arguments against owning slaves on ethical grounds. Early Christian fathers of the church made arguments. Some of them, like John Chrysostom, made arguments against Christians owning slaves. But in the ancient world, there just simply was no equivalent to modern abolitionist movements.
Right.
Just didn't happen. There are also examples of non-Christian, non-European nations abolishing slavery. I'll just quickly point out the first Buddhist king of India, Emperor Ashoka. One of his first orders as king was to abolish slavery because
that's
it was
cool.
Unethical. Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's really cool. Yeah. Huh.
Slavery was also abolished in Japan, I want to say in the 15th century, before the European abolitionist movement.
Interesting.
Because the Portuguese kept enslaving Japanese people.
I mean, I could see why they might feel raw about it. Yeah.
Slight problem. But just to go back to the point that you made, because in a video that I reviewed recently by Dr. David Wood, Wood makes the argument that, and it's a weird argument, and I'm not sure, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, because going back to the science, it's a both and, right?
Right.
The the modern abolitionist movement, it arises out of Christianity.
Sure.
100%. Like that's a very non-controversial claim.
Right.
But David Wood takes that claim to posit this idea that as a result, that therefore Christianity has some sort of like superior ethic.
Right.
That it was because it was Christianity and not Hinduism or Islam or any of the other major world religions,
right,
or religions, period, because Christianity uniquely ended slavery, that therefore should elevate Christianity on a moral level. But to your point, the pushback against that would be, well, why didn't it end sooner?
For sure.
And so the quote I wanted to read, and this is from Chris L. DeWitt in his book, Preaching Bondage, Discourse on Slavery and Early Christianity. DeWitt's an early Christian scholar who specializes in Christianity and slavery. So this is like from the horse's mouth,
yeah,
so to speak. He says, furthermore, the church not only accepted slavery as a social institution, but it used the slave model of behavior and mode of existence as a metaphor for the practice of the Christian religion, the composition of Christian theology, and the formation of Christian subjectivity. The metaphor of slavery also played an important role in Christian leadership. The use of scripture was central to the process of subjectivizing slavery. But along with assuming the subjectivity of the slave and its theological and ethical formations, we find that Christianity also had a clear vision for real institutional slaves in society. It was not a vision of the abolition of slavery.
Okay. And again, I just, because it's going to get thrown out no matter what. We're the atheists. We're biased. We're that is scholar. That is believing Christian. That is, I mean, that, guys, look, again, we are not trying to hide the fact that through Christian institutions, it is able to be formalized. The abolitionist movement is formalized. It grows. It gets a lot of traction. Not disagreeing with that in any way, shape, or form. But if the claim is exclusively because of Christianity, well, yes, exactly. The first Buddhist king, I didn't know that one. That's awesome. I knew about Hypatia of Alexandria, ancient Greek philosopher that talked against slavery, and so like, yeah, I think we need to give the full picture. We need to have the full context, man, because again, honestly, it's a cooler story. It's a better story, and it's true.
Right. And then moving into the modern world, the prime example of this becomes the American South.
Right.
So I'm from the American South, born and raised in the American South. And are you in the South too?
Yeah. Oh, I'm in Tennessee.
Tennessee. Okay. So I'm in the real South, which is Georgia. Aside from South Carolina, then Georgia. South Carolina was the first to secede from the Union. But in Southern culture especially, we have this very strong mixture. The Southern society, almost from the get-go, has been deeply religious.
Yeah.
Deeply Christian, I should say, not to be more specific. And to be even more specific, overwhelmingly Protestant.
Right.
If you look at the demographics, historically, I live in the city of Savannah, Georgia. It's where John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, first landed.
That was my church.
Yes, same. The South has always been deeply religious, deeply Protestant, and has used that Protestantism to justify, historically speaking, one of the most severe and, again, unprecedented forms of slavery which has ever existed.
Yeah.
Which was American slavery.
Yeah.
And this is why, before I said that we have to make a distinction, I think, between ancient forms of slavery and modern forms of slavery.
Right.
Because the modern form of slavery is intimately tied with European colonization.
Right.
The transatlantic slave trade, as you probably know, is the direct, forceful enslavement of Africans in moving those people from Africa to the New World, to South America, the Caribbean, and then, of course, to North America. In the Middle Passage alone, which is the forceful removal of the people from Africa to the New World, it's just in the Middle Passage, it's estimated about 3 million people died. Completely.
Right.
Just in the Middle Passage. That doesn't account for the people that would go on to die on the plantations and working in the fields and all that other stuff.
Right.
So you're talking about a level of brutality that was unimaginable to the ancient world.
Sure.
Like no one could anticipate that.
Sure.
And then also the distinctive feature of it is that it's a racial form of slavery.
Correct.
It's Africans that were uniquely enslaved, because the Africans, once they were brought to the New World, were a people who were set apart. They were identifiable physically because of the color of their skin. They were not American. They were also not indigenous. So linguistically, culturally, in every way, shape, and form, they were different. And that difference was used as a justification for and a basis for not just their enslavement. And this is another unique aspect of slavery, of modern slavery. It's a perpetual form of slavery. So not only were you enslaved, but the rest of your family was enslaved, and your unborn children would be slaves.
Right. Yeah, that chattel slavery type thing.
Yes.
Yes.
And that was unprecedented.
Sure.
On top of that, Christianity was used to justify that institution.
Now, I'm so glad you said that, because yes, again, not discounting the Christian individuals and Christian institutions that were part of the abolitionist movement, but you also cannot discount, for instance, the slave Bible. I mean, something that was specifically written in a manner so as to take out any of the mention of freeing oneself from the bonds of slavery.
Yes. Yeah. So it's a both and, right? Because the Bible would be a source of the abolitionist argument, especially if you look at like the book of Exodus and the freeing of the Jewish people from captivity. Obviously, that's a strong point for the abolitionist. But likewise, if you look at the slave laws in Leviticus or Paul in the New Testament, slaves, be obedient to your masters, right? All of this was used as the justification. Just to give you a small sense of this, one more quote, and I'm sorry, but
no, please.
This is Thomas Dew, who was a senator, a congressperson. I'm not sure if he was a senator from Virginia, and this is from 1832. Dew stood up in front of the Virginia legislature and gave an argument for the institution of slavery, and listened to the reasons why Dew is making his argument. This is the direct quote. "It is said slavery is wrong and contrary to the spirit of Christianity. We deny most positively that there is anything in the Old or New Testament which would go to show that slavery, when once introduced, ought to be abolished, or that the master commits any offense in holding slaves. The children of Israel themselves were slaveholders and were not condemned for it. They were permitted expressly to purchase slaves of heathens and to keep them as an inheritance for their property." And then to end it, he says, "When we turn to the New Testament, we find not one single passage at all calculated to disturb the conscience of an honest slaveholder. No one can read it without seeing and admiring the meek and humble Savior of the world, in no instance meddled with the established institution of mankind."
Oh, I love that quote. I mean, I hate it because I hate what the guys, it's a terrible quote, but I love that quote because it's like, it's one of those moments where you have to say, look, going back to the Civil War, I mean, my grandfather was a local historian his whole life. And again, I've always been a big history nerd and stuff. And, you want to say that the Civil War was about states' rights. Well, the right of the states to do what? To own slaves, like if you think the Civil War and the seceding from the Union at the time was not about slavery, well, you need to tell those people who seceded, because it's the first thing that they list in their new state constitutions,
100%.
So it's like, again, I love that quote because I think it really, really does capture what a lot of people honestly felt at the time. You know, they could be wrong, you guys, okay? People could be wrong for hundreds and hundreds of years. I'm not disagreeing. Galen, for instance, I mean, you brought him up. It wasn't until, you know what, like 1450 something, we have Andreas Vesuvius or whatever comes out and actually starts dissecting people and going like, oh my gosh, this is totally wrong, you know? Super, super cool stuff, you know? So yeah, people could be wrong for a really long time, but then you have to contend with that as the Christian apologist, right? You have to contend with the fact, why did this senator stand up and say that? Because when you read the book, he's right. There's a bunch of stuff in the Old Testament that tells you how to own slaves. There's a bunch of instances of righteous people owning slaves. How many slaves did King David have, right? And then when you finally get an opportunity and Jesus is there rebuking people on various things they got wrong, what does he not say? Never once does he say, don't own slaves, you know? Man.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good work out there. I'll just simply point to they're kind of like they were the power couple of Southern cultural intellectual history, Elizabeth and Eugene Genovese. They have a fantastic book called The Mind of the Master Class, which is kind of like a intellectual history of Southern history. There's an entire chapter on there about religion and slavery, but the major takeaway point is that slavery and the institution of slavery permeated every aspect of Southern society and culture. Like there is no South without the institution of slavery, and that includes religion. So did Christianity give rise to the abolitionist movement? Absolutely. 100%. But it also was used to justify, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, the most brutal form of slavery which has ever existed.
Right. And
both of those things.
Right. And that is okay that it is both. There is nothing wrong that it is both. The problem is when somebody wants to say, on either side, by the way, on our side as the atheist or on the Christian side, if you want to say, no, SR, Christianity is entirely responsible for slavery, it did nothing to get rid of it. Well, man, look, I just got to tell you, that doesn't seem to be what the history says. But if you're going to stand there and tell me, Christian apologist, that there was something particularly unique about Christianity and the abolition movement, well, I just have to tell you once again, no, it just doesn't seem to be where the history shakes out. And again, I really do think it's a cooler story. I think this story is much more fascinating. It is much more interesting because one of the things that you see is, for instance, the Southern Baptist Convention literally splitting their congregation because of this issue. This church doesn't exist without the institution of slavery being a main sticking point. And this is something we're seeing today too in various religious institutions. The Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Anglicans, the Baptists, they've all split over the last handful of years on a couple of different, what would be essentially the same type of hot button issue of the day. And that is just fascinating to me. I think it is such a cooler story that way.
No, that's a fantastic point. I think to understand how something like this is possible, to your point, would be to look at how contemporary Protestant churches have debated over like gay marriage would be a big one.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, going back to the Methodist Church, I think split over that, but there
absolutely.
There were Methodist pastors and preachers again arguing for both sides, not to compare gay marriage and slavery, obviously.
No.
Two very different things.
Yeah.
The intellectual arguments how one institution such as the church could hold divergent opinions.
And again, what's great now, obviously, is we have, in so many ways, we have such better capacity to document all of this. And, you know, unfortunately, as we go back further and further, you know, in the timeline, it becomes a little bit more difficult. But at that point in time, in the 1800s, guys, we may not have had video cameras, but we definitely had good ways of documentation. So we do have reliable firsthand accounts from people that we can corroborate with other accounts that we know for a fact. Hey, yeah, there were some Christians out there actively pushing against slavery. But there were other people in other cultures doing it for a really long time as well. We've got those examples. And we've also got the exact opposite. We've also got a lot of examples of people saying, no, you don't understand. It is because I'm a Christian that I'm a slaveholder. That is really important that we see both sides of that, you know?
Yes. Yes. And there's a lot of documentation about that.
Right.
One of the things I have my students do, it's extraordinarily uncomfortable, but I have them read both pro and anti-slavery sermons, for example.
Oh, wow.
That were delivered. As well as one of the examples that I read, political arguments that were given in Congress for and against the existence of slavery. But slavery, especially American slavery, is a hot button topic from the get-go, like just immediately out the gate. So yeah, would highly recommend any of the Genovese's work. Mind of the Masterclass is what I referenced there, but
that sounds like a really cool book. Honestly, I would really enjoy the crap out of that.
It's very dense.
It sounds like it though. It sounds like it would be one of those. Yeah. It sounds like one of those things you'd really have to, you know, chunk it up, man, and get like, you know, 100 pages here and then set it down for 2 days and think about it, you know? Like, well, dude, this has been so much fun, Micheal. I really appreciate you coming on and talking with us. I love both of those focuses. They're fascinations for me. And again, one day we are gonna have to bore everybody, you know, and their freaking socks off. But we are going to talk about your thesis because that does sound like a super cool, nerdy niche thing that would just be very fun to see where that goes. But we definitely cannot go without you letting everybody know all the places that they can find you and see more of your work and hear more about you, man. So where can everybody come and stalk you virtually?
YouTube is the best place to do that. I've kind of leaned away from Twitter. I'm not on there anymore, to be honest with you. You can find my contact information on YouTube if you ever want to reach out. Of course, I'd always love to have you comment on my videos, watch my videos. If you come across like one of these arguments that apologist makes, by all means, send it to me. Always more than happy to make a response video. Yeah.
Heck yeah. I love that, man. Yeah. So definitely, guys, if you are not familiar with Micheal's stuff, please go out there and check him out. And just, get yourself some really solid arguments in your tool belt. Next time some apologist is telling you, you know, oh yeah, science is only around because of Christianity, or no, there's no such thing as slavery in the Bible, you know. But of course, also, I have to give a massive thank you and shout out to the wonderful patrons like Cindy PLAZA, Left, Right, Left, and Ryan Hammond. You guys help make this possible. And of course, all of you wonderful people in the chat. I can't actually see you. I just wanted to let you know that. Like, I don't, you know, but I see your names, you know. But I see you out there, and you guys are been lively this whole time. You have been keeping this going, and we greatly appreciate you. You know, look, if you haven't done the things, do them. You know what they are: the liking, the commenting, the subscribing, the sharing, the running, you know, after a stranger and being like, you really got to see this episode, it's so good. Like, I mean, okay, maybe don't do that. That would be a bad idea. But yeah, you guys know what to do. And of course, if you ever have any other cool guests or ideas, folks, I know Ethan is always looking. So just, yeah, feel free to reach out here or, hit him up on Patreon, guys. Send him $5 every now and then. Doesn't hurt. But we are going to get the hell out of here and go do some sinful things. Or at least I am. That's what's on my agenda.
I'm going to sleep. Yeah.
That's probably a better call. Yeah, maybe I'll do that instead. But thank you all so much. And we will see you next time.
Thank you.